In pre-colonial India, birth dictated the trajectory of your entire life, fixing every individual into a specific caste hierarchy. Access to knowledge was a closed loop. It was a monopoly held by the upper caste Brahmin elite, who served as the exclusive gatekeepers of literacy and law. The curriculum was strictly theological. Students spent years memorizing ancient Sanskrit texts, a language that the common population could neither speak nor read. This system was defined by its exclusions. Shudras, Chandalas, and women were barred from learning under the threat of severe social and religious consequences. Without access to a different framework of logic or a competing history, the existing social order remained the only reality. Practices like untouchability and female infanticide continued because there was no intellectual space to challenge their validity. The East India Company fought to keep modern education out of India for decades. While colonial rule is often associated with English schools, the early administration viewed them as a direct threat to their stability. Having recently lost the American colonies to a rebellion led by educated lawyers and merchants, British officials feared that teaching Indians Western ideas of liberty would lead to a similar uprising. To keep the peace, the British strategy relied on funding traditional Sanskrit studies. They believed that reinforcing the existing caste hierarchy would maintain a more compliant and predictable population. The push for a different system came from Christian missionaries. Upon their arrival, they documented the social inequalities and rigid discriminations of the caste system with increasing alarm. They concluded that religious preaching was not enough to change these social conditions. They began advocating for the introduction of rational, secular knowledge as a way to disrupt the traditional cycles of suppression. This led to a sustained lobbying effort in London. The missionaries pressured a hesitant British government to finally permit the establishment of modern English medium schools. In 1823, the British government tried to compromise by proposing a new traditional Sanskrit college in Calcutta, aiming to satisfy the local Orthodox elite. This plan was met with a public protest by the Indian scholar Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Roy argued that India did not need more focus on ancient grammar or theological philosophy. He insisted the country required modern science, mathematics, and logic to advance. As a result, missionary schools began appearing across the country, carrying a syllabus that was a radical departure from anything taught in the traditional Gurukulas. This flowchart illustrates the shift. In these new classrooms, students were introduced to the works of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Thomas Paine, and they began to study the mechanics of the American and French revolutions. These concepts changed the way students viewed authority. By studying the history of human rights and democratic governance, they gained the vocabulary needed to question the legitimacy of both the British Empire and their own social traditions. The most significant change was who was allowed in the room. By ignoring caste distinctions, missionary schools ended the exclusive Brahmin control over education. This inclusivity reached Jyotirao Phule, who was born into a marginalized gardening caste. He was struck by the missionary concept that equality was a universal human right. In 1852, Phule used these principles to open the first school in India specifically for children from the untouchable castes, directly challenging thousands of years of social tradition. This movement soon reached women, who had been historically barred from intellectual life. Phule and his wife organized schools that brought girls into formal education for the first time. Converting education from a gated privilege into a public tool provided the organizational blueprint for India's internal social reforms. This new education system became a mirror for Indian society. It allowed a growing class of thinkers to analyze their own culture through the lens of modern logic. They began to target the internal institutions that held the country back, specifically challenging the religious dogmas and the hierarchies of caste supremacy. This outcome was exactly what the East India Company had feared in the early 1800s, that a Western-educated population would eventually demand its own freedom. The schools produced intellectual leaders who dismantled the empire, including Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. They used British logic, equality, and democracy to highlight colonial contradictions. This intellectual shift powered the careers of Gandhi, Nehru, and Patel, sparking a coordinated series of political protests that eventually spanned the entire subcontinent. Modern education ended the caste monopoly over knowledge. It provided a new vocabulary of rights and logic that a generation of leaders used to build a modern, independent republic.